This morning, I want to share with you a story. It's a story about the first black person to become a Unitarian minister, and it's not a simple story, and he wasn't a simple man, but the story is rich, with many gems to be mined from its midst. So listen for a few minutes while I give you the short version of the life of Egbert Ethelred Brown. Ethelred Brown was born in Jamaica in 1875, and he died in New York in 1956. He was brought up a traditional Christian. He was educated. One Easter, when he was about 9, and he was in church, he had a sudden realization. He realized that unlike the fellow churchgoers, he did not believe that God could possibly be a Trinity. God could not be one and also be three: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. How could this be, he asked. But it was only many years later, that he felt his call to the Unitarian ministry. In the meantime, he grew up to be a civil servant, an accountant. And at the age of 32, with a wife and 4 children, he had to resign under a cloud from the civil service, apparently because he'd taken some money out of the treasury and was found out before he was able to pay it back. Not a great start for ministry. But that experience, that loss and humiliation, jolted him into a place of deep reflection on his life and its direction. And in time, he decided that ministry was his calling. He never turned back. In 1907, Ethelred Brown wrote and mailed a letter that he addressed, quote, to any Unitarian minister in New York. He was throwing a tiny little string or rope out into New York, from Jamaica to New York City, trying to find out how he could become a Unitarian minister. Sadly, but not surprisingly, he eventually received a reply that was somewhat discouraging from the head of the Unitarian Theological School, Meadville Lombard. President Franklin Southworth's letter said, as Brown later recalled, that as there was no Unitarian church in America for colored people, and as white Unitarians require a white minister, he was unable to predict what my future, wrote Ethelred Brown, would be at the conclusion of my training. But Brown persisted. You're going to hear me say that several times. This man was tenacious. And eventually, Meadville Lombard, despite its concerns about his future in the ministry, finally accepted him as a student. Brown took a steamer to America to enroll at Meadville Lombard. Unfortunately, however, he didn't have the proper paperwork, and he was immediately put back on a boat to Jamaica. The next year, he tried again. This time, the day before he was scheduled to leave, his father reneged on a promise that he'd made to actually pay for the ticket. And so the only thing Brown could send on the boat that he was supposed to board was a letter of explanation to the school explaining why he wasn't coming. Finally, in the following year, in 1910, he bought his own ticket with the money that he'd saved, and he succeeded in getting to the Unitarian Theological School in the United States. After finishing Meadville Lombard in 1912, the now Reverend Brown went back to Jamaica. He went back to found the first Unitarian church in that country. He received a modest amount of financial assistance from the American Unitarian Association back in the US, which saw the aid as a humanitarian gesture for the downtrodden Negro rather than as the founding of a real church. Unitarian leadership in this era never had faith that a black church would succeed, and the association quickly withdrew its support. Dr. Reverend Mark Morrison Reed has written a wonderful book called Black Pioneers in a White Denomination that contains the story of Egbert Ethelred Brown, and he writes of the leaders of the denomination at that time and I quote, "These men may have accepted that the souls of all people were equal before God and their rights were equal before the law. But the educated upper-class white man's moral and intellectual superiority was unquestioned." So that first church starting failed, and then Reverend Brown moved to another town, and he tried again in Jamaica to start a new church. That one failed also. So finally, he decided he was going to move to New York City with the goal of starting a Unitarian church in Harlem. He brought his family to New York, and they began. Again, support from the central Unitarian leadership was minimal. The letters from the time that we can read make clear that the leaders did not believe that Black Americans had the capacity to understand and accept Unitarianism. So Brown struggled all his life to make that Harlem church a vital one, but he never raised enough money to buy a building or to pay himself enough to actually support he and his family. Struggling through those decades to make ends meet, he also consistently annoyed the white Unitarian leaders and some of the ministers by repeatedly and directly soliciting donations from fellow ministers as well as the association, because he was scrapping to get by and he worked as an elevator man. He broke one of the cultural rules of behavior for the white elite group. As a result, the white Unitarian leaders decided to quietly, secretly, take him off the rolls of the ministers in good standing in our denomination. They did this on the grounds, which had never been enforced with white ministers, that his employment as an elevator man to support his church work disqualified him from being a minister. In other words, because he wasn't paid enough by the church to get by, he would be stripped of his minister status. When Brown finally heard about this process, he fought back. And eventually, after several years, he was reinstated to the ministry roles. But Brown wasn't just tenacious in his desire and his commitment to be a Unitarian minister. He was also an achiever, a mover and a shaker in other areas of life. He was a political radical and a skilled orator. He was active in the union movement in Jamaica before he came to the U.S., and he continued to work for fair wages once he arrived here in 1910. He was also politically active. Among other things, he served as a spokesperson for the Socialist Party in the United States for several years. He co-founded the Jamaican Progressive League, which was the primary American-based organization of the time that supported nationhood for Jamaica. And he promoted that cause of independence in front of colonial government bodies and at meetings all over Jamaica at various times. So in many ways, when I think about Reverend Brown, I think he was your prophetic Unitarian minister par excellence. He combined activism, social reform advocacy, and preaching and pastoring. Indeed, Karl Marx's famous statement that religion is the opiate of the masses got this reply from Reverend Brown. Brown said, "Religion is not an opiate, but a stimulant, an incentive to noble deeds and a sustaining power in the hour of crisis." Back to the Unitarian leadership, in the 1930s, a new generation of white leaders came to power in the association. And at that point, the association's relationship with Brown became much warmer. Eventually, he got a pension even from the association. Reverend Brown's words in our reading this morning sum up well the transition and the situation he found over the course of his ministry. You remember he said, "At the beginning of my ministry, it was my task to prove, not to the world, but to Unitarians, that Negroes are capable of becoming Unitarians. Unitarians, whatever they may have said in easy words, found these truths hard to accept. The Unitarians were already dedicated to the principles of the brotherhood of all men. The principles sounded good. Behind them, there was little conviction. The initial phase of my task," he wrote, "I have been this initial phase of my task, I've been lucky enough to have somewhat accomplished. When we reflect back on this story that I've just told you about a driven and intelligent and prophetic Unitarian minister, black Unitarian minister, a number of themes come to the surface. We can see, as Brown did in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, the blind spot of racism in the Unitarian leaders in the movement. Today, we call it racism. And we also are able to acknowledge that we're still dealing with forms of racism in ourselves today. We can acknowledge that we're still dealing with forms of racism, more subtle forms, today because of another great gem that this story of Ethelred Brown illustrates. And that is that we've been entrusted with a tremendous gift. It's the gift we call the living tradition. The gift that we know that our faith will evolve, that our faith opens like a rose. We know that we will grow in our moral understanding, and our faith will open because it demands that we look at our lives and our actions critically and reflect on how our actions match or don't match our values. As a living tradition, our faith requires we ask the question, how are we doing? And be willing to listen for answers from our blind spots. Reverend Brown's changing relationship to the association, the other ministers over time, their evolving understanding of what the principle of the brotherhood of all men meant, these demonstrate the life in our tradition as they demonstrate the capacity of determined people of faith to keep talking to each other, to stay connected and engaged, even when the differences go very deep indeed and injustice is being perpetrated. But the most important gift that I take away from Reverend Brown's story is this. When I first began thinking about this sermon, my initial tendency was to hear his story, Reverend Brown's story, as a commentary on my own white story, on our own predominantly white Unitarian Universalist story. My first look, like that of our forerunners, was blinded by the white, to paraphrase Bruce Springsteen's famous lyrics. Blinded by the light, blinded by the white. If we allow ourselves to be blinded by the whiteness of ourselves, Brown becomes just a symbol. He becomes a token of something that's important to us, important about us, our white Unitarian Universalism, our blind spots. He becomes a symbol of our blind spots. And isn't that just a subtle form of using him, a subtle form of racism itself? In other words, the black person is important just for what his story says about me. And I was certainly moving down this path. But the wonderful thing is, as I read more about him and I read his words, I discovered that his story was so rich, I couldn't look at it just as a symbol of our own shortcomings and our own blind spots. Because, Reverend Brown was not a victim, and he was so much more than a struggling minority person in a predominantly white movement. When you know about his political and his labor involvements and his successes, as well as his ministerial ones, we see that he was truly a holy disturbance, a benevolent rage, a revolutionary love. He's inspiring. So as we learn about him, as you learn about him, don't you want the tenacity that he had to bless the world? Don't you want that ability to be a holy disturbance, to bind up wounds and welcome the stranger, to praise what is sacred, to do the work of justice? May he inspire us all to that end. Amen. Blessed be.